Renowned Christian apologist and theologian Dr. William Lane Craig, like most Christians, believes that the God of Christianity ostensibly desires a relationship with humanity. As he articulates here,
rather, what he wants to do is to build a personal love relationship of trust and faith with human persons.
one major problem rears its head once this belief is assumed, and that problem is that not everyone believes in the Christian God. In fact, not only is belief in the Christian God not completely pervasive amongst God's very own creation, but it's not even the majority belief. According to current estimations, Christians make up only approximately 31% of the world's population, and that's assuming a broad definition of the notion of what makes someone a Christian. But if God desires a relationship with humanity, then why is knowledge of his existence not vastly more widespread and obvious? Why doesn't everyone just know that the Christian God is an actual and undeniable part of the world we inhabit? I mean, keep in mind that the Christian God, by most conceptions, is omnipotent. That is to say, the Christian God supposedly has unlimited power to bring about any logically consistent reality. So why hasn't he taken the proper steps to put sufficient conditions in place that would guarantee that belief in his existence is completely ubiquitous? Dr. Craig himself considers this line of thought.
It's certainly true that God could have made his existence a lot more obvious than he has. He could have written, "made by God," on every subatomic particle in the universe. Or he could have planted a neon cross in the sky saying, "Jesus saves," so that his existence would have been patently obvious. But from a Christian perspective, you've got to ask, why would God want to do that?
Why would God want to do that? I maintain that Craig lacks quite an imagination here. Why would God want to guarantee that his existence is obvious to his creation? Well, for the crucial and pivotal reason that in order for a person to have a relationship with God, a necessary condition is that one believes that God exists in the first place. After all, you can't form a loving relationship with someone you are unaware exists. Suppose for a moment I had an estranged daughter from birth who knew nothing of me whatsoever, including whether or not I was even alive. And suppose further that after years of being an absentee father, I finally decided to get my act together and pursue a filial relationship with her. The very first prerequisite to possibly achieving such a relationship would be taking the necessary steps on my end to demonstrate to my daughter that I did, in fact, exist. Again, you can't form a loving relationship with someone you are unaware exists. So, setting aside the fact that my daughter can still choose to embrace or reject a relationship with her biological father, she would assuredly need to first know that her father exists before she can even entertain the notion of embracing such a filial relationship. To put this a bit more precisely, the condition of knowing that a being exists is a necessary condition for having a personal relationship with that being. Thus, as a corollary, if one doesn't even know that a specific being exists, then one cannot possibly have a personal relationship with that being. So Craig's questioning why God would possibly desire to sufficiently convince more people of his existence seems quite poorly thought out, to say the least. Nevertheless, let's let Craig continue his thought.
You see, I think from a Christian perspective, God is relatively indifferent about just getting people to believe that he exists. He's not interested in having people add one more item to their ontological inventory. Rather, what he wants to do is to build a personal love relationship of trust and faith with human persons. And it is by no means obvious that if he had made his existence more obvious than it is, that would have increased the number of people who come to love and to know him.
Over the years, I've witnessed some extremely shoddy reasoning and unsound inferences on the part of Dr. Craig, but the argumentation just witnessed is by far some of the worst on his part I've ever seen. First, Craig claims that on Christianity, God is relatively indifferent to getting people to believe that he exists, and that God is not interested in having people, quote, add one more item to their ontological inventory, end quote. This is quite a coarse way to phrase the issue. God is not interested in having people add one more item to their ontological inventory? He articulates this as if God is just another being in the universe whose existence is relatively inconsequential to humanity. Well, Dr. Craig, if God, the foundation of all existence and creation, the one through whom everything lives and moves and has its being, if this God desires a personal and loving relationship with the most intimate thing he created, then it seems to me to be quite a pertinent issue that in our ontological inventory we add in the creator of the universe, don't you? The way Craig brushes off this whole notion is intellectually petulant, as if God has more important concerns than whether or not the very thing he created, for the sole purpose of entering into a loving relationship with him, happens to believe in him. As we already surveyed, this should be God's primary concern. Because a logical prerequisite of entering into a loving relationship with God is first, believing that God exists. Now, Craig's argument becomes even more untenable if you can believe that, and I want to replay part of that last clip so that we can closely decipher exactly where Craig is argumentatively planting his flag for his position.
Rather, what he wants to do is to build a personal love relationship of trust and faith with human persons. And it is by no means obvious that if he had made his existence more obvious than it is, that would have increased the number of people who come to love and to know him.
Craig quite literally articulated that God desires to build a personal relationship with his creation, and in the very next breath, Craig articulates that it's not at all clear that if God had made his existence more obvious to his creation, that this would have increased the number of those who likewise desire to build such a relationship with their Creator. I hope the viewer realizes precisely how irrational Craig's position is. Craig actually believes that even though belief in God is a logically necessary condition for entering into a relationship with him, increasing the former would not increase the latter. To express this a bit more rigorously, if X is a necessary condition for Y, which is to say that in order to have Y you need to have X, then if one wants to increase the number of Y's, then one must logically increase the number of X's. And in this case, X represents people believing in God's existence, and Y represents people desiring to enter into a relationship with God. So again, if people believing in God's existence is a necessary condition for people desiring to enter into a relationship with God, then if one wants to increase the number of people desiring to enter into a relationship with God, then one must logically increase the number of people believing in God's existence. Craig claims that this is not at all clear or obvious. On the contrary, Dr. Craig, this is as clear and obvious as anything could possibly be. But let's make it even clearer and more obvious for Craig. To revisit my earlier analogy as an absentee father, let's alter the analogy so that instead of one estranged daughter, I have 5. I know, in this analogy I'm not exactly winning Father of the Year. Now, let's say that although I have 5 estranged daughters who know nothing of me whatsoever, including if I'm even alive, let's say that in addition to this, I have one daughter who does in fact know I exist and does in fact have a loving relationship with me. Now, suppose again that I desire to get my act together and that I desire a relationship with not only the one daughter that knows me already, but with all my daughters. The very first prerequisite to possibly achieving such relationships would be taking the necessary steps on my end to demonstrate to my estranged daughters that I do, in fact, exist. Again, you can't form a loving relationship with someone you are unaware exists. Now, based on what we've surveyed from Craig, we can surmise what his response would be. If he's intellectually consistent, his response would be that my actions are quite unnecessary. Do you know why? Because according to Craig's reasoning, it is not at all clear that if I made my existence more obvious to my estranged daughters, that this would increase the number of them that desire to build such a relationship with me. This line of reasoning is incredibly absurd. The only possible way to increase the number of daughters of mine that desire to build a relationship with me is to first make my existence clearly and unambiguously known to them. Does this guarantee that any of my estranged daughters will actually want a filial relationship with me? Of course not. But in order to even have the possibility of one or more of them desiring a relationship with their father, they first need to have knowledge that their father exists. This is Logic 101. Now, setting this analogy aside, Dr. Craig's position also has another fatal issue that it overlooks. Listen to what Dr. Craig articulates here.
And so I think God has given evidence of his existence which is adequate for those whose hearts and minds are open to God. Blaise Pascal once put it this way. He said, God has given us evidence which is sufficiently clear for those with an open mind and an open heart, but which is sufficiently vague so as not to compel those whose hearts are closed.
To anyone that has even a superficial familiarity with people of differing faiths, this line of reasoning from Craig is, again, simply vacuous and unconvincing. Craig claims that the evidence God has supplied is sufficient to convince those whose hearts and minds are open to him. But are we really to believe that devout and faithful adherents of faiths like Islam or Mormonism, i.e. people who are not convinced that the Christian God exists, are simply those whose hearts and minds are closed to the evidence for God? Forgive me, but I find myself completely incredulous in accepting a premise such as Craig is putting forth. Any person who is honestly engaged with faithful adherents of differing faiths knows that they are just as open-hearted, devout, and sincere in their beliefs and in their search for God and in their service of this God. They simply happen to not believe that this God is to be found exclusively within the Christian religion. For Craig to paint this entire demographic as those close-hearted and closed off to the idea of God is lazy apologetics, to say the least. Again, these devout religious adherents clearly do desire a relationship with God. In fact, they are firmly convinced that they do in fact possess such a relationship. How then can Craig truthfully say that individuals such as these do not actually desire such a relationship with the creator of the universe? Because to deny this would be for Craig to admit an uncomfortable truth about his religious framework, namely that his God clearly has not done the sufficient legwork to guarantee that his existence is unambiguously known. But Craig is not, and likely never will be, willing to grant this. And thus, his reasoning we've surveyed in this video is purely ad hoc, and more importantly, is not the least bit convincing. What we've seen then is not a single good explanation from Dr. Craig regarding why belief in the Christian God's existence is so scarce. If God's actions bear any resemblance whatsoever, even analogously, to human reasoning, then we should, without a doubt, expect that a God that is all-loving and all-powerful and desires a relationship with humanity would, at the bare minimum, make his existence sufficiently clear to all of his creation. This is undoubtedly not the case. And so just as many fail to be compelled to believe in the Christian God, I maintain that we should likewise fail to be compelled by the apologetics of Dr. Craig on this point specifically. Thanks for watching.